Said earlier this day, I spoke with Vice President Mike Pence in his ceremonial office at the Eisenhower Executive Office building right next to the White House. I started by asking about the details of the deal with Mexico.
I was in the negotiations on Wednesday. They initially offered to move thousands of National Guard to their southern border. But before the end of the day, before the end of the week, 6,000 Mexican National Guard to their southern border. They'll be doing checkpoints throughout Mexico to determine people's immigration status as they move through their country. And most notably of all, Mexico has agreed to take back all of the people from Central America who've come into our country, applied for asylum, and have them remain in Mexico while we consider their asylum requests. These are things Mexico had never agreed to do before. They're doing them now, and it's all a result of President Trump's strong and decisive leadership. But the truth of the matter is, we need Congress now to step up. I mean, Mexico has actually done more to address the crisis on our southern border than Congress has, and it's time for Congress to step up, to provide the resources, and most importantly, Bret, it's time for Congress to work with this president and this administration and reform our asylum laws, close the loopholes that human traffickers are using to entice people to take the long and dangerous journey north. That's what's going to be necessary, but the steps Mexico have taken represent a decisive step towards securing our border, and we're grateful.
Mr. Vice President, you know your critics say that a lot of this stuff was in the works, in the pipeline, and that maybe that the troop numbers are increased, but that former Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen testified December 20th, 2018, aliens trying to game the system to get into our country illegally will no longer be able to disappear into the United States, where many skip their court dates. Instead, they will wait for an immigration court decision while they are in Mexico, which is what you're saying they agreed to.
Right. There's been a lot of talk about Mexico securing their southern border, and there was a lot of talk, as Secretary Nielsen testified, about a Remain in Mexico program. But when we sat down last week, Mexico had only agreed to 3 ports of entry being used for us to return people to Mexico. Only 300 people a day were going back to remain in Mexico. Once we fully implement the agreement that President Trump secured, we'll have several thousand people that will be able to return to Mexico, where they will remain while their asylum application is being processed.
The president hinted that there was something else that's pending. Is there something else to be announced?
There is, Bret. Look, the president's focus here is on outcomes. We don't want to reach an agreement and then simply implement that and focus on process. The president's objective here is to reduce the number of people that are coming into our country illegally. But if all of this doesn't work, the president's made it clear within 90 days we have a backstop.
Mexico did not agree, though, to accept a safe third country treaty. That's really what you wanted, so that people coming in could then basically seek asylum or refuge in Mexico first. Is that in the offing? Is it a possibility, or are you disappointed that that didn't happen?
We're not disappointed in this agreement. We've also reached an agreement with Guatemala to reform our laws to essentially say that if people are looking for asylum, that they ought to be willing to apply for asylum in the first safe country in which they arrive. But look, we'll only move on to that if it's necessary.
The president seems encouraged that China is going to come back to the table. I wanted to ask specifically about Huawei. He indicated in a question, answer to a question, that Huawei may be sort of a chess piece in larger trade talks, suggesting it could be a part of the negotiations. Is Huawei a national security threat to the U.S., or is it kind of a piece in a larger trade negotiation?
The position of the United States of America is that Huawei, which the Communist Party of China and their government have complete access to, all of the data that they collect, represents a fundamental compromise of our national security and of the national security of our allies, and will continue to stand firm in that regard. But I think what the president's communicating is that all of these issues are open for discussion. But what he's made clear with President Xi, and as we look to the G20 coming up in a few short weeks in Japan, is that things have to change. And it's not just a matter that China is half of our international trade deficit. It's well beyond that. But it's the way China has conducted themselves, the theft of intellectual property, of what we call the structural issues, protecting private property, and basically the international rules that have governed international trade for generations. And the United States is going to continue to stand firm on that. This president has imposed $250 billion in tariffs on China at this point. We believe we're in a very strong position. And the president believes we could more than double that, but we hope for better.
But you see the disconnect there. I mean, either it's a national security threat or it is going to be one of the big issues on the table talked about with China. Isn't it one or the other?
Well, we believe it is a fundamental national security threat, and we've said that to our allies very consistently. The president wants to get people to the table. We're willing to talk about everything, but he's always going to put the interest of America first and American security first.
Two more things along that line. The president was on CNBC today. Critics have said that the tariffs are kind of a blunt instrument to use in trade overall. One of those critics, traditional Republican ally, U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The president said this.
I'm a member of the U.S. Chamber. Maybe I'll have to rethink that, because when you look at it, the Chamber is probably more for the companies and the people that are members than they are for our country.
You agree with that?
Well, I agree that President Trump is for the country.
But not the Chamber?
Out for the broad interests of the American people. Look, I understand the business community doesn't like tariffs, but we would have no deal with Mexico if the president hadn't announced 5% tariffs that were set to take effect today. But look, whether it be with China, whether it be with other countries around the world, this president has been willing to use the economic power of the strongest economy in the history of the world, in using access to our market in the form of tariffs, to put American jobs and American workers first. And I couldn't be more proud to stand with him as he does that.
Last thing, former Vice President Joe Biden is going to be in Iowa tomorrow, as is President Trump. The former Vice President got a little bit of grief from Democrats for saying that you are a pretty good guy. What do you think of Joe Biden?
Look, having been Vice President for more than 2 years, I respect all 47 of my predecessors and their contributions to the nation. But I got to tell you, to see the way that Joe Biden has been spun around on a number of issues, whether it be his opinion of me, whether it be his long-standing support for the Hyde Amendment and opposing public funding of abortion, whether it be a broad range of issues. I have to tell you, whether he's the Democrat nominee or any of the rest of them are, I think the president and I are ready to take any one of them on. And so as you see the former vice president changing positions on issues just about every other day, and you see the rest of the crowd all dashing to the left, I think the American people are going to continue to be drawn to this president's consistent, common sense, conservative leadership, and I couldn't be more proud to stand with him.
Mr. Vice President, we appreciate the time.
Thank you, Bret.